Amidst the calm of my everyday life, an unexpected visit from a familiar face shattered everything. What started as a simple interaction soon spiraled into a conflict I never saw coming. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we dive into a story where the main character finds themselves facing a situation that many of us can relate to. Have you ever been caught in a situation where emotions and boundaries blur and you're not sure how to find your way out? Watch till the end to see how the character navigates this complicated path. And whether you're a first-time viewer or someone who's visited my channel before, I'd be so grateful if you could help me reach 1,000 subscribers soon. It would really motivate me to keep bringing you more captivating stories. So let's get started. I never thought my life would lead me to this point. A quiet small town where I had built everything I dreamed of. A simple life filled with love and warmth. When I first married Daniel, my college sweetheart, I believed we had everything. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. Or so I thought. I remember the day we moved into our new home like it was yesterday. It wasn't much. A small house with a garden and a little backyard, but it felt like ours. We were excited about this new chapter of our lives, ready to start building a future together. I didn't realize then that this home, with its creaky floors and cozy spaces, would eventually feel like a prison. Our landlord, Mr. Davis, was a man in his early 60s. He always wore a smile, exuding kindness with every word he spoke. I never thought much of him at first, just a friendly old man who checked in on us every once in a while to make sure the house was in good shape. But things started to change. Daniel's work took him out of town more frequently, leaving me alone in our home. It was during these long stretches of solitude that I began to notice Mr. Davis more. At first, it was subtle. He would come by unannounced just to check on the house, or sometimes just to chat. First, I didn't mind. In fact, I welcomed the company. But the more time I spent with him, the more I felt something shift. It wasn't just his politeness anymore. It was the intensity of his attention. His eyes lingered on me a little longer, and his compliments, once casual, began to carry a weight I couldn't ignore. It was small things at first, remarks about how well I took care of myself, how beautiful the garden looked. They should have been harmless, but they weren't. It was a quiet afternoon when things began to feel truly off. The air was still, the sky a muted blue that seemed to mirror my thoughts, distant and cloudy. I was out back, tending to the garden, trying to lose myself in the rhythmic motion of pulling weeds and checking on the plants. Gardening had always been my escape, a simple, grounding task that cleared my mind. But today, the usual tranquility was shattered by a soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. I froze, my fingers gripping the handle of the spade a little tighter as I turned my head. There he was, Mr. Davis. I had grown accustomed to his visits. At first, he would stop by once every few weeks to check on the house, perhaps offer a few words of wisdom about keeping up the garden. But lately, his visits had become more frequent. He would pop by without notice, sometimes to fix something trivial, other times just to chat. And though I tried to brush it off, to pretend that everything was still the same, the truth was, his presence was beginning to make me feel uneasy. He smiled as he approached, that familiar smile, but today it felt different. His eyes, usually friendly and benign, now seemed to have an intensity to them that sent a chill down my spine. The kindness was still there, but there was something else, a weight beneath it that I couldn't quite put my finger on. "You're happy here, right?" he asked, his voice soft, almost too soft. The question struck me like a punch to the gut. I was taken aback. Of course I was happy with Daniel, but lately, with him being gone so often, I had felt a sense of emptiness growing within me. I had tried to ignore it, buried it under the routine of daily life, but it was there, like a hollow space in my chest. Yes, I answered, forcing a smile. "I'm happy with Daniel." But even as the words left my lips, I knew they weren't entirely true. I wasn't sure if I was happy, or if I was simply clinging to the idea of happiness because it was what I was supposed to feel. Daniel's long hours at work, his constant business trips, had left me alone more times than I could count. The silence between us had become unbearable at times, and the absence of his presence in our home made everything feel distant, like I was living in a place that didn't quite belong to me anymore. I tried to push the thoughts away, but Mr. Davis wouldn't let it go. His gaze lingered, searching me as though he could see right through the smile I was giving him. "It's easy to forget how important it is to have someone to talk to," he said, his words hanging in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating the space between us. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. I wanted to laugh it off, to say it was nothing. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just a friendly conversation. It never was. His visits, his compliments, they were beginning to blur the lines of propriety. I felt the uncomfortable heat rising in my cheeks, my body tensing, as if I were preparing to defend myself against something invisible yet undeniable. I brushed it off, nodding in response, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Yes, I know," I said with a quiet chuckle, hoping to downplay it. "I appreciate that." But as soon as the words left my mouth, I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. His presence was no longer a comfort. It was a reminder of the growing distance between Daniel and me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Davis was trying to fill that gap in ways I didn't want. I had to end this, I told myself. I had to create distance to shut this down. But the problem was I didn't know how to. His visits became more frequent after that. And with each one, the change became more apparent. He no longer just spoke about the house or the weather. He spoke about me, my appearance, my mannerisms, the way I took care of myself. At first, it was easy to dismiss as flattery. But as time wore on, the compliments began to feel heavier, more loaded. He noticed things no one else seemed to. "You always look so lovely when you're working in the garden," he said one day, his voice trailing in a way that made my skin prickle. "It's like you're at peace with everything around you." I didn't know how to respond. What was I supposed to say to that? Thank you felt too small, too inadequate, considering the weight behind his words. And yet, I didn't want to upset him. Didn't want to make things awkward. But it was becoming too much to ignore. Then came the night when Daniel was away on business, and I found myself alone in the house again. I had settled into the couch, a book in hand, though I wasn't really reading. My thoughts kept drifting to the unsettling feeling that had taken root in my mind. I tried to focus on the quiet hum of the house, the creak of the floorboards, the faint rustle of leaves outside the window, but it wasn't enough. My mind wouldn't quiet, not with the memory of Mr. Davis's words still echoing in my head. And then the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I looked through the peephole, there he was, Mr. Davis, standing at the door with that damn smile that seemed to stretch wider than usual. "I was just in the neighborhood," he said, stepping inside without waiting for me to invite him in. First, I didn't think much of it. I was used to him stopping by, though this time it felt different. His presence was more invasive, more deliberate. As he made his way inside, I could feel the air in the room shift, grow heavier. There was something about the way he moved, his gaze following me, that made my heart race in a way I didn't understand. He sat down on the couch beside me, a little closer than usual, and my discomfort immediately flared. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was overreacting. But with each word he spoke, the tension built. He wasn't just being polite anymore, he was being personal. "You're a remarkable woman, Sarah," he said softly, his voice low, almost like a secret. "I've never met anyone like you." The compliment hit me harder than I expected. I didn't know how to react. I felt my body freeze, my thoughts scattering. I wanted to say something, to tell him to leave, to create space between us. But the words didn't come. It was as if I was frozen in place, trapped by the intensity in his voice, the weight of his stare. His eyes held mine, dark and intense, and I couldn't look away. It was like he was waiting for me to respond in a way that would make this moment feel real, like he was daring me to admit something that I wasn't ready to face. The silence stretched between us, suffocating. I wanted to shrink away from him, to move to the other side of the room, but I couldn't. I couldn't seem to do anything. My heart was racing, my breath shallow as I sat there, motionless, not knowing how to break free from the tension. For a moment it felt as though the world had stopped, as though time itself had paused to give us space to navigate whatever this was. I wanted to scream, to push him away, but I stayed still, trapped in the suffocating air of the room. The man I had once seen as just the kindly landlord had become something else. Something that now held my attention far too much. I started, but my voice faltered, words failing to form as I realized how close we were now, physically and emotionally. It was too close, and I couldn't tell if I wanted him to pull away or pull me closer. And then, just like that, Mr. Davis stood up. "Well, I should let you get back to your evening," he said, a soft smile returning to his face, though I noticed the slight shift in his demeanor. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay." I nodded, a shaky breath escaping my lips as he turned to leave. He didn't say anything else, but I knew deep down that things had changed. He had crossed a line, and I wasn't sure if I could erase the effect his words had on me. He left without saying goodbye, leaving me alone with my racing heart, unsure of what to do next. What had just happened? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning? The more I saw him, the more I noticed how his presence affected me. It wasn't just the usual politeness that once seemed so normal. No, it was something different now. Something unsettling. His gaze lingered. Not just in passing, but with purpose, as though he was trying to study me, read me in ways that made my skin feel tight and uncomfortable. His compliments, too, grew bolder. They started off as innocent remarks, "You look nice today," or "You've really kept this place looking beautiful." But soon, those compliments began to touch places that were much too personal. Every time he visited, I felt that same sense of unease settling in my chest. I tried to brush it off, tried to convince myself that it was nothing, but deep down I knew it was something. And then, there was this other part of me, the part one didn't want to acknowledge, that felt flattered. It was late evening when Mr. Davis came by again. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the house had already started to settle into its familiar evening stillness. I was alone, of course. Daniel had gone off on another business trip. His absence was becoming a familiar echo in our lives. He was rarely home, and when he was distant. Our connection was strained, and the silence between us had begun to feel like a permanent resident in our home. I had just finished tidying up the living room when I heard the familiar soft knock on the door. First, I thought I might just ignore it. He'd been coming by more often lately, and I had grown weary of his uninvited visits. But the thought of facing another awkward conversation with him sent a cold shiver down my spine. And yet, when I opened the door, there he stood, Mr. Davis, with that smile that now seemed to stretch just a little wider than usual. "I was just in the neighborhood," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His voice casual but with an underlying edge I couldn't ignore. I smiled politely, stepping aside to let him in. It had become almost routine, though the discomfort I felt every time he crossed the threshold of our home was anything but routine. He had always been a kind man, at least at first. But now his presence in our house, his proximity, felt like an encroachment I wasn't sure how to handle. We exchanged pleasantries at first, but it didn't take long for the atmosphere to shift. It was subtle at first, just a little closer than usual, his eyes lingering a bit too long on mine. The air in the room began to feel thick, charged with something I couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't just conversation anymore. His words seemed heavier, his voice softer, like he was trying to share something secret with me. He moved closer, almost imperceptibly, and I felt my body tense, as if instinctively trying to create distance. But it was as though the space between us was closing without either of us needing to make a move. I could smell his cologne, faint but persistent, a scent that lingered in the room long after he'd left. He leaned in just a little, his presence overwhelming in a way that was both captivating and suffocating. "I've been thinking a lot about life lately," he began, his voice a little more serious than usual, the words carefully chosen. "Sometimes we get caught up in the day-to-day, and we forget what really matters." I wasn't sure what he meant by that. It sounded like a platitude at first, something anyone could say. But the weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment I found myself unsure of how to respond. Was he talking about his life? Or was he talking about mine? "I don't know how to explain it," he continued, his eyes never leaving mine, as if they were searching for something in me that I hadn't yet acknowledged. "But I feel a connection with you, Sarah. A special kind of connection." I froze. His confession, though gentle, hit me like a sudden blow. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was powerful in a way that made the room seem smaller, the air thicker. I felt my heart race, an instinctual panic rising in my chest. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to deny it, to brush it off as another of his harmless comments. But the way he looked at me, there was something different about it. Something more than just a casual observation. He wasn't just the landlord anymore. His presence had shifted. There was something intimate in the way he spoke to me now. Something that made my skin prickle in discomfort. I felt trapped between politeness and the undeniable discomfort of the situation. How could I respond? How could I reject his words without causing an awkward rift? I didn't want to hurt his feelings, but at the same time, I didn't want to encourage whatever this was. His gaze held me captive. His voice lowered, laced with something unspoken. The room felt colder despite the warmth of the evening, the walls closing in around me. "I'm married," I finally managed to say, my voice shaking slightly as I fought to regain some composure. "I have a husband." I had to remind myself. I had a commitment, a life outside of whatever this was. But Mr. Davis wasn't fazed. He didn't back away or apologize. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice softening even more, a trace of something wistful in his tone. "I know, but sometimes the heart wants what it wants." His words hung in the air, heavier than any silence that had come before them. I could feel the air shift, the tension between us thickening. It was as if he was daring me to respond, to acknowledge that what he was saying wasn't as wrong as it seemed, to entertain the possibility that maybe I felt something too. The room felt like it was shrinking and I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, to escape from the weight of his gaze, but I couldn't. I was frozen. His words had planted a seed of doubt in my mind, an ember of confusion that sparked between us and burned me from the inside out. I looked down, unable to meet his gaze anymore. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing with conflicting thoughts. I loved Daniel. I was committed to him. But right now, in this moment, I didn't know how to navigate the space between us and Mr. Davis. What was he doing here? Why was he saying these things? I knew I had to set a boundary, but the words wouldn't come. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. It was as if I was too scared to break the silence, too terrified of what would happen next. Would I offend him? Would he leave? Or would he stay, pushing further into the space he had already claimed in my mind? Finally, I managed to pull myself together enough to say, I think you should go." The words felt like a lifetime coming out of my mouth, and as soon as I spoke them, I regretted it. I knew I had to be firm, but in the pit of my stomach, I felt a sense of loss. I wasn't just rejecting him, I was rejecting something else, something I couldn't name. Mr. Davis didn't seem angry. He didn't fight me. Instead, he stood up slowly, his expression unreadable, before turning to leave. But before he walked out the door, he looked back at me once more, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite understand. "I hope you understand, Sarah," he said softly. "I really do." But I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. And then he was gone. I stood there motionless, staring at the door long after he left. My heart was still racing, my body frozen in place. What had just happened? I didn't know how to process it. I didn't know what to do with the feelings that had stirred within me. The discomfort, yes, but also something else, something deeper. I couldn't ignore it. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to. The days after that conversation were filled with a swirling mix of guilt and confusion. I didn't tell Daniel what had happened. And in some ways I knew I should have. But part of me feared his reaction, and another part of me was ashamed to admit to him that I had even allowed Mr. Davis's attention to occupy my thoughts, let alone the unsettling feeling of being drawn to it. Each time Mr. Davis came by after that, whether it was to check on the house or just to say hello, I felt the tension building between us. He was polite, always offering a reassuring smile, respecting the boundaries I had set, but it felt like his outward respect was just a thin layer over something far deeper. Something unspoken but so palpable that it weighed on my chest like a stone. I could feel it every time our eyes met. His gaze, though soft, lingered a little too long. And the silence between us was thick, suffocating even. He would speak, but his words seemed to carry more meaning than they should. There was a heaviness in the air, as if everything he said had a double edge, one of kindness and the other of something more dangerous. A line had been crossed, and I wasn't sure how to navigate the mess that followed. I tried to keep my distance. I tried to remind myself that I was married, that my commitment to Daniel should be enough to shield me from whatever pull Mr. Davis had on me. But no matter how hard I tried, it wasn't enough. The feelings that had begun as subtle sparks were now unmistakable and undeniable heat, a connection that neither of us could pretend wasn't there. I had to set clear boundaries, I knew that, but each time I tried, I felt the edges of those boundaries blur. It wasn't just Mr. Davis's visits anymore. It was the way he spoke to me when he came. The way his voice softened, the way he would ask how I was feeling with such concern. It wasn't just about the house anymore, it was about me, and in some twisted way. It made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. That afternoon, he came over again. The sun was setting, casting a golden light across the house. I was at the kitchen counter, preparing dinner, when I heard his knock. At first, I thought I would ignore it, but something in me told me that wasn't an option. When I opened the door, there he was, standing a little too close to me, his usual smile on his face, but this time it seemed tinged with something else, a seriousness, a quiet intensity. "I just wanted to stop by," he said. His tone soft, almost apologetic. "I've been thinking a lot about things, about how I've been acting. I owe you an apology." The word struck me in a way I hadn't expected. I had imagined him apologizing for his behavior, but this felt different. The sincerity in his voice, the hesitation in his eyes, made it feel real. "I understand that I overstepped," he continued, his gaze never wavering from mine. "But I wanted you to know how I feel. I never meant to make you uncomfortable." I nodded, my throat dry as I tried to absorb his words. My heart beat in my chest like a war drum, and my mind raced to find something to say. Something to keep him from saying more, something to stop the momentum that had been building between us. "I appreciate your honesty," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But I'm married, Mr. Davis, and I need to focus on my family. My commitment to my husband has to come first." The words were like a breath of air after being submerged underwater. I could feel the relief wash over me. The tension that had built up between us in recent weeks seemed to lift slightly. And for a moment I allowed myself to think that it might finally be over, that this conversation would be the end of it, that he would understand and leave things alone. But even as I said it, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that it wasn't over. The relief I felt in that moment was only temporary. Deep down, I knew it. The tension between us wasn't something that could be undone by a simple conversation. The things that had been said, the glances we shared, the weight of his unspoken feelings, none of that could simply vanish. Mr. Davis stood there for a moment, his face unreadable, his expression softening as he processed my words. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a sadness, perhaps, or maybe something else. He opened his mouth to speak, but I could see the hesitation in him, as though he was fighting with himself to say what he needed to say. "I know," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "but sometimes the heart wants what it wants." The words hit me harder than I expected. They weren't just a confession, they were an invitation. An invitation to continue down a path I knew was wrong, a path I shouldn't even consider. But his words, his look, left me paralyzed. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a wave of guilt rush over me, flooding my chest and tightening my throat. I wanted to turn away, to close the door on this whole situation and pretend that none of it was real. But there was a part of me, something deep inside, that didn't want to let go. It was as if Mr. Davis had placed a weight on my shoulders, one that I wasn't sure I could lift. The silence between us stretched on, thick and heavy, until finally he stepped back, his gaze lingering just a moment longer before he turned to leave. "I won't come by again unless you want me to," he said quietly, as if trying to respect my wishes. But I could tell that it wasn't just about that. It wasn't just about being polite. It was about something else. I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Thank you for understanding." He nodded back. And without another word, he walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, the weight of everything he had said lingering in the air long after he had gone. I closed the door softly, the sound of it clicking shut resonating in the quiet of the house. But it didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt full. Full of the tension that neither of us had acknowledged. Full of the emotions that I didn't know how to process. I turned around, leaning against the door, trying to calm my breathing. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Had I made the right choice? Was this really the end of it? Or had I just opened the door wider for something that was bound to come crashing through eventually? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the hardest part wasn't admitting that Mr. Davis's attention had affected me. It was the realization that I didn't know what to do with those feelings. The guilt, the confusion, the undeniable pull, it was all too much. And now it felt like the beginning of something I wasn't ready to face. The days that followed the last encounter with Mr. Davis felt like I was walking through a fog. There was an inescapable tension that had taken root in my life, festering quietly behind every smile, every conversation, every fleeting moment. The events of those days felt like they were crawling under my skin, digging into my thoughts and most dangerously of all, my conscience. As much as I tried to bury it, the guilt gnawed at me, a constant reminder of the line I had allowed someone to cross, a line that would forever mark the space between what was right and what was undeniable. It wasn't just the guilt, though. It was something else, something that lingered every time I saw Mr. Davis or even thought about him. It was an attraction I couldn't deny, even though I knew it was wrong. A part of me hated the fact that his words, his presence, had managed to break through the emotional walls I had spent years building. But another part of me, the part that was afraid of the growing distance between Daniel and me, almost welcomed it. And that, more than anything, scared me. Each time Mr. Davis stopped by, I felt that mixture of discomfort and forbidden desire. His presence was a reminder of the tension that had been quietly building between us for weeks. Every time I saw him, I tried to push away the uneasy, guilty feelings, but they clung to me, following me around like a shadow. His compliments had grown bolder, less innocent, and with each passing encounter, I found myself wrestling with emotions I didn't want to feel. I told myself I was strong, that I wouldn't let anything pull me away from what truly mattered, but every time he smiled at me, I felt myself faltering. I was trapped, but not just because of him. I was trapped by my own fears, my own insecurities. The more I pushed back, the more Mr. Davis seemed to press forward. And yet I couldn't escape the feeling that I was the one encouraging it, even if subconsciously. I knew what this could mean for my marriage, for everything I had worked so hard to build with Daniel. And yet, every time Mr. Davis spoke, a small part of me relished in the attention, the fact that someone noticed me, saw me in a way that Daniel didn't. It was a dangerous line to walk. And I was teetering dangerously close to the edge. One evening, Daniel came home. I was in the kitchen when I heard the familiar sound of his footsteps on the stairs, and for a moment, I felt the weight of his presence grounding me. We hadn't had much time together lately, and though I loved him, there was a small, nagging voice in my head telling me things weren't the same. When he entered the kitchen, I forced a smile, trying to push the lingering doubts and confusion away. "It's good to have you home," I said, my voice soft but underneath the words, there was an underlying tension I couldn't shake. I tried to make it sound natural, but something about the way I said it, the way I felt saying it, made me realize that everything had changed. I wasn't the same person anymore. I wasn't sure what had happened, but the truth was I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't pretend that I wasn't caught between two worlds, one where I was committed to Daniel, and one where the pull of Mr. Davis's attention was becoming harder to ignore. As we sat down to dinner, the silence between us felt heavier than it had in the past. Daniel noticed my quiet demeanor, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he reached across the table and squeezed my hand, offering a small, comforting gesture. But it didn't comfort me. I realized in that moment that I was losing myself, piece by piece, and no amount of his touch could make it go away. "I've missed this," he said. His voice genuine, his eyes full of warmth. He was trying, but there was a disconnection between us that I couldn't ignore. "I know," I said, forcing another smile. "Me too." But in my mind, I wasn't there. I wasn't with him. My thoughts drifted back to Mr. Davis, to the way he had looked at me, the way his words had affected me. How had I let it get this far? How had I let this situation become more than just an innocent exchange? I tried to remind myself of the love I shared with Daniel, of the promises I had made, but the image of Mr. Davis's eyes haunted me. I couldn't look at Daniel the same way anymore. My heart was split in two, and neither side felt like home. I knew I had set the boundaries. I had told Mr. Davis that I wasn't interested, that I was married and committed to Daniel. But despite the words I had said, I couldn't ignore the fact that something had already shifted inside me. The tension between Mr. Davis and me wasn't something that could be undone by a simple conversation. It wasn't that easy. It never was. And I knew it. The relief I felt when I told Mr. Davis to respect my boundaries was short-lived. In the quiet moments that followed, I realized just how much this situation had impacted me. It wasn't just about Mr. Davis anymore. It was about me. I had allowed myself to question my own values, to entertain something that threatened everything I had worked for. And the guilt, the shame, it was suffocating. I knew I had to make a choice. But the question was, could I walk away from the temptation? Could I walk away from the part of me that was craving attention, that was craving affirmation? Could I find my way back to the life I had with Daniel, or was I too far gone? I need to make a decision, I whispered to myself, my thoughts swirling in a mixture of fear and resolve. The truth was, I was afraid. Afraid of losing Daniel, afraid of the consequences of my actions, and most of all, afraid of what I had become. The choices ahead of me were not easy, and I couldn't undo what had already been done. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't keep living like this. The tension had to end. I had to end it. But how? Now I'd love to hear what you think. What are your thoughts on this story? Do you agree with the choices the character made, or would you have done things differently? Leave your comments and feedback below. Let's talk about it. And if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to stay tuned for the next chapter. Your support means the world to me and keeps me motivated to bring more stories your way. Thanks for sticking with me until the end. See you in the next one.